Hi guys. Okay, we are on chapter 7. The Pirate Set Sail, page 77. Just when Tom's life seemed to be worth living again, misery set in. Becky Thatcher finally returned to school. Tom was overjoyed when he saw her familiar blonde hair and glowing face in the schoolyard. He tried to get her attention by jumping over the fence, yelling, laughing, doing handsprings, standing on his head, and throwing secret glances in her direction. But nothing worked. Becky never even looked at him. Poor kid. Tom's cheeks burned in shame. He had made a fool of himself, so his cheeks went red. He couldn't stay at school and be miserable, so he gathered his things together and sneaked off. That's perfect. That's a direct quote that I could use. So with my thesis statement, do you remember I said Tom is a bad student because, and one of my reasons was he would skip school. This is a direct quote that proves or is evidence that he skips school. So I could use this as evidence for one of my reasons that Tom is a bad student. He walked and walked until the school was only a tiny black speck in the distance. He was gloomy and desperate. Nothing mattered now. He was a friendless, forsaken boy, and nobody cared whether he lived or died. Okay? So one thing I could do with that is something that makes Tom really interesting for me is how dramatic he is. Dramatic. Okay? So this is a characteristic that he has that I think makes him interesting. And I'm going to write page 78. Now that is not a direct quote. Okay? That's just what I think, that Tom is dramatic. Okay? And then I could use a direct quote like, nothing mattered now. He was a friendless, forsaken boy, and nobody cared whether he lived or died. Okay? So, he's just dramatic. If you don't know what that word is, look it up, okay? So that's something I could write down on my character list about Tom. Yeah. Okay? He was so deep in his misery that he didn't see his old friend Joe Harper heading towards him. Now, we're not going to write down Joe Harper as one of our characters. He appears again and again in this story, but he's not a main character. Right now we have Aunt Polly, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Muff Potter, and Injun Joe. I think, and we have Becky. So we have 6 characters right now. And I believe those are the 6 that we are going to have for the whole book, and we won't add any more characters. Okay? Joe looked worse than Tom. He explained that his mother had just punished him for drinking some cream, which he had never even tasted. He swore he was completely innocent. The 2 boys walked along, spilling out their misery to each other. They made a pact, or a promise, to stand by one another as brothers and never separate till death. They began to plan some way of escaping from their lives of misery and pain. These poor boys. Joe wanted to be a hermit and live on crusts of bread and water, but Tom had a much more exciting idea. He suggested that they become pirates. Tom knew of the perfect pirate hideout, a small uninhabited island out in the Mississippi River called Jackson's Island. He and Joe sought out Huck Finn and invited him to join them on this wild adventure. When Huck agreed, they made plans to meet at a lonely spot on the riverbank 2 miles above the village at midnight. Each would bring fishing hooks and lines and as much food and other provisions as he could steal. It was a starry and very still night as Tom made his way out of the village. The mighty river lay like an ocean at rest. When Tom reached the bank, he heard nothing, so he gave a low, distinct whistle. It was answered. Both Huck and Joe appeared from behind a bluff. Joe carried a side of bacon, and Huck carried a skillet, or a pan that you cook with. a bag of tobacco, and corn cobs from which to make pipes. Tom showed them the boiled ham cakes he had brought. The boys loaded their provisions onto a small raft tied up on the bank, and they pushed silently away from the shore. So a raft, it's not a boat, but a raft is something that's made out of wood, so little logs of wood, and is very small. If you've seen Moana, the Disney movie Moana, she goes on a raft, okay? So it's just logs of wood, okay? About 2 o'clock in the morning, the raft grounded, so arrived, on Jackson's Island. The boys jumped off, tied the raft to a nearby tree, and set out to gather wood for a fire. They built their fire against the side of a great log and cooked some bacon for dinner. The climbing fire lit up their faces and threw its ruddy glare on the trees, foliage, and twisting vines. When dinner was over, the boys stretched out on the grass and fell into a deep, contented sleep. Contented is happy. Tom awoke the next morning, wondering where he was. It took a few minutes for him to realize that he had actually run away from home. Have any of you run away from home? I have. I was only gone for about an hour, though. It didn't last long. Joe and Huck were fast asleep. Tom woke them, and they all began talking excitedly. In a minute or two, they had stripped off their clothes and were chasing each other and tumbling about in the shallow water, so they started swimming. They returned to camp wonderfully refreshed, happy, and very hungry. Soon, Huck had the campfire blazing again. They had a delicious breakfast of coffee, bacon, and fried catfish, which Huck had caught. After filling themselves until they could eat no more, the boys explored the island a bit. They discovered that it was about 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. The shore that lay closest to the mainland was separated from the island by a narrow channel hardly 200 yards wide. Okay, so when they talk about the mainland, so we'll say this is the mainland, okay? This is where they live. Okay, that's where their home is. And then they took their little raft, okay, over to this little island. And let's see, it says it was about 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. So you have this little island that they went to. We'll have like some trees here. Okay, so that's where they went, okay? And there's this is about 200 yards wide. Okay, so you get kind of an idea that this is where they lived, and then they kind of went across the water to this little island, okay? The boys took a swim every hour, so it wasn't until mid-afternoon that they finally returned to camp. After feasting on cold ham, they threw themselves down in the shade to talk. But the talk soon began to drag and then died. So they weren't talking anymore. It was just, they had nothing else to say. The stillness and the sense of loneliness began to affect the boys. So they were alone and they were feeling it. Soon they all realized that they were truly homesick. And we've talked about homesick before. You have home and you have sick. So you are sick for your home. You miss home. Even poor homeless Huck Finn was dreaming of doorways and life back in town. But the boys were all ashamed of their feelings, and none of them were brave enough to utter a word. So they felt bad about their feelings, and they didn't want to share it with one another. Suddenly, the boys became aware of a peculiar sound in the distance. It was a strange, muffled boom. "Let's go see what it is," shouted Tom. They sprang to their feet and hurried to the shore. They parted the bushes on the bank and peered out over the water. A little ferry boat, right there. So it's a boat that carries people from like the mainland to the island, or the mainland to another mainland, okay? A little ferry boat was steaming up the river about a mile below the village, its deck crowded with people. Suddenly, a great puff of white smoke burst from the ferry boat's side, followed by that same dull, booming sound that they had heard earlier. "I know now!" exclaimed Tom. "Somebody's drowned." "That's it!" cried Huck. "They did that last summer when Bill Turner drowned." So drowned means you can't swim, so you drown, so you can die. You die from not being able to swim. "Now I remember. Folks say that the boom will make a drowned body rise to the surface." "I sure wish I was over there now," said Joe. "I wonder who it is that drowned." So, do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So the loud boom of the cannonball leaving the cannon, they think that a body that had drowned would come up to the surface of the water because of the boom. So the vibrations would bring the body up. Okay. The boys stood still as they listened and watched. Presently, a thought flashed through Tom's mind, and he shouted, "I know who's drowned! It's us!" They had become heroes in an instant. They were missed. They were mourned. Hearts were breaking because of their running away. The whole town was talking about them. Here was their triumph at last. Being pirates was worthwhile after all. So they were really excited because all of a sudden people really cared about them. People wanted to know where they were. They were worried. And so Tom's like, "Dude, we're heroes. We're famous now." As twilight evening drew on, the boat went back to the dock in town, and the pirates made their way back to camp, excited over their discovery. They caught a fish, fried it over the open fire, and talked all during dinner. Their conversation centered on what people might be saying about them and who was missing them. But when the shadows of night closed in, they stopped talking and sat gazing into the fire. The excitement was gone now, and Tom and Joe could not help thinking about the people back home who were not enjoying this little adventure at all. They began to have misgivings, so they were regretting or they felt bad for leaving. And soon they drifted into sad, troubled moods. Joe was the first to timidly mention these feelings. He asked Tom and Huck how they might feel about returning to civilization, but the two boys only laughed and denied any homesickness at all, so they didn't want to admit that they were homesick. When the fire had died and the boys all turned in for the night, when the fire had died, the boys all turned in for the night. All that is except Tom. So they all went to bed except Tom. So think about what things make these characters interesting. So think about Tom. What made him interesting in this chapter? The fact that he runs away from home. He's okay with that. And then you can find a direct quote that supports that if you want. So remember, for your assignment this week, you're looking for a direct quote. Okay? Yeah. I'll let you think about that, okay? All right.